Happy Wednesday, Mount members and friends. Welcome to the 5th lesson in our fall Bible study series. As we normally do, I ask that you share this video with family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, anybody who you think would benefit from this knowledge. If you're watching on Wednesday at 12 or 6:30 p.m., we are live on Facebook, YouTube, and Dialpad meetings. If by chance someone you'd like to connect with us doesn't really do social media or YouTube, they can actually call in at 804-203-9011. All right, let's get started. If this is your first time joining us for this series, we are using Dr. Aubrey Hendricks' book, The Politics of Jesus, along with the Bible as our guides. In it, he lists 7 strategies that he believes Jesus uses that are political in nature. Strategy 1 taught us to treat the people's needs as holy, and it really is the foundation of the other 6. Strategy 2 empowered us to give voice to the voiceless. Strategy 3 encouraged us to expose the workings of oppression. Strategy 4, which Pastor Nelson taught last week, encouraged us to call the demon by name. And I encourage you, if you've missed any of them, after you watch this lesson, to go back and look at the other 4. They're very impactful and informative. And that leads us to today, this week, when we move on to strategy 5, which is save your anger for the mistreatment of others. Save your anger for the mistreatment of others. Once again, we're in the Gospel of Mark, this time in the 1st chapter. Now, I want you to listen to Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45 in the New King James Version, and then we're going to play it using an AI voice for Dr. Hendricks' own translation from the original Greek. All right, let's listen.
Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. And he strictly warned him and sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded, as a testimony to them."
And a leper came to him, begging on his knees, and said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with anger, he stretched out his hand and said to him, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And snorting with anger, he sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, as a testimony against them."
For centuries, Western biblical translators have softened the meaning of words and phrases they thought too challenging to the powers that be. For instance, the word tyrant occurred more than 400 times in the Geneva Bible, an English translation published in 1560. Still, the King James Version, published less than 100 years later in 1611, does not use the word tyrant even once. Dr. Hendricks notes that it is unlikely that the English language had changed that much in so short a time. It is more likely that King James himself had the translators of the King James Version use other words such as oppressor or troubling to avoid criticism of his monarchy. Perhaps the king was unwilling to see in print a term that could cause readers to think about how the Bible's words could be used to promote freedom and liberty from an earthly king. There are numerous other instances of translations that soften or completely change the meaning of biblical terms and phrases with political implications. By softening politically loaded biblical terms, phrases, and pronouncements, those in political control have sought to focus on personal morality. And Reverend Nelson has dealt with that over the course of this series. They believed that if the disprivileged masses were self-centered in their thinking of what is just and right, then they won't fight for the holistic justice of God that frees the oppressed and topples tyrants. Not only did translators employ questionable renderings, but early scribes of the New Testament sometimes substituted other words for actual biblical terms and phrases that did not fit their own devotional expectations or political sensibilities. And I know that this is a lot, because some of us were taught that the King James Version was the only version of the Bible that was truly sent down from heaven. But again, it wasn't published until 1611, and the word existed a long time before then. One important example of this is the treatment of the Greek word dikaiosune, which most versions of the New Testament translate as righteousness, a term that primarily connotes personal morality. Yet the association of righteousness with personal piety obscures dikaiosune's holistic meaning of justice. Justice is personal and social and spiritual and political. As we have seen, justice involves the active, purposeful transformation of the entire social and political order by demanding a fair and equitable distribution of power and resources from those in authority and in control. When dikaiosune is translated with its holistic meaning of justice, it can powerfully transform biblical meanings in ways that are more consistent with Jesus's meaning. For instance, in Matthew 6:33, we're used to hearing, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." But consider this. What if it really meant, "But seek first the kingdom of God and God's justice, and all these things will be added to you as well"? This becomes a clarion call for believers to strive for the justice of God on earth as it is in heaven. Even the Beatitudes, which are usually understood as pertaining solely to personal ethical behavior, instead become instructions for social and political activism, as in Matthew 5:6. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied," becomes "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be filled." Another important example of this phenomenon concerns the rendering of the Greek word that is usually translated as tribulation. The Greek word means to press or hold down or oppress. Thus, it should not be translated as tribulation, which connotes a personal misfortune sometimes occurring by chance, but as oppression, which is often a political phenomenon. Oppression is the intentional subjugation of less powerful segments of society by those with greater power, often by the most brutal means. So when it is correctly translated as oppression, its political meaning for Jesus can be fully seen. His instruction in John 16:33 for his disciples to continue in faith becomes both a social commentary and an exhortation to persevere in their challenges to the current order. So what we often read is, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." But in reality, it should have been translated, "In the world you have oppression, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." Going back to last week, this is an example of Jesus calling the demon by name. In the book Politics of Jesus, Dr. Hendricks chose to print his own translation of the Mark 1 text because he adds that those familiar with the passage will notice major differences between his translation from the Greek text and the way the passage appears in the King James Version and most other English versions of the Bible. He said that he tried to correct the misreading so the real meaning of the passage becomes clear. Listen to him explain some of those changes. And again, this is AI because there is no audiobook available.
In my translation, Mark 1:41 does not read "moved with compassion" or the like, as found in most translations. Instead, it reads "moved with anger," from the Greek word orgistheus, which means filled with anger. This term, orgistheus, occurs in a number of authentic early Greek manuscripts of Mark's Gospel, and as we shall see, makes more sense in this context. Yet English translations exclusively employ splagznistius, filled with compassion, the other term found in ancient manuscripts. Bruce Metzger, one of the world's foremost experts on the translation of ancient New Testament manuscripts, acknowledges that it is easy to see why orgistheus would have prompted over-scrupulous copyists to alter it to splagznistius.
Hendricks goes on to say that what Metzger refers to are the biblical scribes who were reluctant to see Jesus as subject to the all too human emotion of anger. Although the Gospels do portray Jesus as an eating, drinking, flesh and blood social being, many Christians are reluctant to see him as fully human. Mark does not share this aversion, however, because in several passages, like Mark chapter 3, verse 5 and Mark chapter 10, verse 14, he portrays Jesus as both angry and indignant. In Mark chapter 1, verse 43, there was also a problem for translators. The words in the original Greek would have meant to snort with anger. But instead of this correct reading, most translations offered watered down phrases like sternly charging him or strictly warning him. Hendricks concludes that biblical scholars have not been able to envision Jesus with any degree of anger greater than giving someone a stern warning. And the problem becomes this: because biblical scholars haven't acknowledged Jesus' anger in this instance, they have no idea what his anger was in response to. But that is what Dr. Hendricks uses strategy number 5 to explain. Sometimes translators try to make sense of the passages that they translated by inserting words that were not in the original text. For instance, the Greek phrase in Mark chapter 1, verse 44, that some translations like the Revised Standard Version use, they say, "Go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But the problem is that the context of the verse involves opposition. So it would have been better to translate as a testimony against them, against the priest, not a testimony to the priest. To be clear, this is the way the RSV, the King James Version, and most other translations render that same phrase in Mark 6:11. They say, "And if any place will not receive you and they refuse to hear you, shake the dust from your feet as a testimony against them." Perhaps the reason most translators have rendered the phrase differently in Mark 1:44 is that they have misunderstood Jesus' anger and the opponents who caused it. So why was Jesus angry in Mark 1? Well, it was not because of any offense or affront he might have felt personally. If we know nothing else, we know that whatever anger Jesus displayed in the Gospels was never because of his own mistreatment, but it was his response to the oppression and mistreatment of others. Unlike many of his people, particularly the religious authorities, Jesus was not scandalized because a leper touched him. In fact, Mark tells us that Jesus felt such empathy that he actually touched the man, who may not have felt the touch of another for years. Jesus himself risked being ostracized by the temple authorities as unclean for touching someone that they had deemed to be unclean. So how do we account for Jesus' anger? Surely Jesus was not angry at God for the man's condition, and he was not angry at the priest who had declared the man a leper according to their biblical mandate to protect their community from this contagious disease. During this time, the priests were responsible for carrying out the dictates of Leviticus 13, which instructed them to examine those with obvious skin disturbances to determine whether they should be declared clean and be allowed to return to the fruits of community life, or unclean and continue to be excluded from the fellowship, companionship, and security of community. We can't look at this text through 21st century eyes because we have advanced medical technologies. So we must understand that in Jesus' day, men and women were regularly declared to be lepers, even though there was no clear definition or diagnosis for leprosy. Many skin conditions were identified as leprosy, when in reality, some were not contagious, so they did not need to be separated from community at all. For example, the appearance of even a benign skin condition like eczema or psoriasis could be wrongfully diagnosed as leprosy and in turn destroy a person's life. Leviticus 13 instructs priests in ways to keep leprosy from spreading, and among the ways is condemning those who the priest determined to be lepers to live alone in a habitat outside the community. It is important to note that while Leviticus 13 does command that those afflicted with leprosy be kept physically outside of the village for the safety of those in the village, nowhere does it say that they should be relegated to inferior social status. Indeed, clean and unclean were never meant to be judgments of character or of anyone's worthiness to be loved and considered and cared for. The concern of the scripture was hygienic and sacramental. People were removed for a time so that they could get well and get back into community. But what was happening was that they were sent away and treated as second-class citizens. To be declared a leper was not only to be declared unclean, it meant that one was relegated to inferior social status, to be discriminated against, to be excluded, to be treated roughly and rudely. Lepers were required to wear torn clothes, have disheveled hair, and announce their presence by crying out, "A leper is coming," or "unclean." Those afflicted with leprosy were not welcome in the homes of their family and friends or neighbors because their presence rendered the dwellings so unclean that all cooking, eating, and drinking utensils had to be destroyed, unless they were made of non-porous stone. Lepers were sometimes even driven away with sticks and rocks if they ventured too close because the clean didn't want to become unclean. Now, the same biblical prescription that banished those suspected lepers also includes measures for lepers to be brought back into the community life. But I got to tell you, it's a lot. And so I want you to listen to the instructions in Leviticus chapter 14 about how to bring lepers back into the community.
The Lord said to Moses,
"These are the regulations for any diseased person at the time of their ceremonial cleansing when they are brought to the priest. The priest is to go outside the camp and examine them. If they have been healed of their defiling skin disease, the priest shall order that 2 live clean birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the person to be cleansed. Then the priest shall order that one of the birds be killed over fresh water in a clay pot. He is then to take the live bird and dip it, together with the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop, into the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. 7 times he shall sprinkle the one to be cleansed of the defiling disease, and then pronounce them clean. After that, he is to release the live bird in the open fields. The person to be cleansed must wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe with water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. After this, they may come into the camp, but they must stay outside their tent for 7 days. On the 7th day, they must shave off all their hair. They must shave their head, their beard, their eyebrows, and the rest of their hair. They must wash their clothes and bathe themselves with water, and they will be clean. On the 8th day, they must bring 2 male lambs and 1 ewe lamb a year old, each without defect, along with 3/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, and 1 log of oil. The priest who pronounces them clean shall present both the one to be cleansed and their offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then the priest is to take 1 of the male lambs and offer it as a guilt offering, along with the log of oil. He shall wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. He is to slaughter the lamb in the sanctuary area where the sin offering and the burnt offering are slaughtered. Like the sin offering, the guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. The priest shall then take some of the log of oil, pour it in the palm of his own left hand, dip his right forefinger into the oil in his palm, and with his finger sprinkle some of it before the Lord 7 times. The priest is to put some of the oil remaining in his palm on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. The rest of the oil in his palm the priest shall put on the head of the one to be cleansed, and make atonement for them before the Lord. Then the priest is to sacrifice the sin offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from their uncleanness. After that, the priest shall slaughter the burnt offering and offer it on the altar together with the grain offering, and make atonement for them, and they will be clean. If, however, they are poor and cannot afford these, they must take one male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved to make atonement for them, together with 1/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, a log of oil, and 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, such as they can afford, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day, they must bring them for their cleansing to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest is to take the lamb for the guilt offering together with the log of oil and wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. He shall slaughter the lamb for the guilt offering and take some of its blood and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. The priest is to pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and with his right forefinger sprinkle some of the oil from his palm 7 times before the Lord. Some of the oil in his palm he is to put on the same places he put the blood of the guilt offering, on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. The rest of the oil in his palm the priest shall put on the head of the one to be cleansed, to make atonement for them before the Lord. Then he shall sacrifice the doves or the young pigeons, such as the person can afford, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, together with the grain offering. In this way the priest will make atonement before the Lord on behalf of the one to be cleansed. These are the regulations for anyone who has a defiling skin disease and who cannot afford the regular offerings for their cleansing.
Did you get all that? And toward the end, did you notice that not only did the leper have to beg the religious authorities to be treated like a human being, they also had to give an offering. That is, they had to pay the temple priest to be treated humanely again. That is what Jesus refers to when he said, "Offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded." This system subjected the sick to double oppression: financial, social. In the Bible, lepers could be freed from their forced social exile if a priest examined them and found them to be clean. What Hendricks suggests in The Politics of Jesus is that it may well have been that the man confronting Jesus had been branded a leper and was treated like a leper, when in fact he was not leprous, or he had been cleaned of leprosy after the prescribed time. Perhaps the man had been reduced to begging for relief and he was sick and tired of being sick and tired. If so, added to the painful ostracism he endured would have been the agony that his pleas to be re-embraced as a healthy member of society were dismissed by those who were supposed to have helped him. In that case, Jesus' anger at the leprous man's plight makes sense. If the man had asked the religious authorities to declare him clean, but their response to him was callous, lacking justice and compassion, then Jesus rightfully got upset. And so should we. Dr. Hendricks says that this is what the scripture seems to be telling us, for the Greek term used in verse 43, which is usually translated as sent him away, can also mean sent him back, in which case the verse would read, "And snorting with anger, Jesus sent him back to the temple priest." The picture that emerges from all these considerations is that Jesus was angry because this man was crying on his knees as the result of his treatment at the hands of the priests who were supposed to be God's representatives in the earth. It's true that lepers had a condition that set them apart, but for Jesus, that was no reason for them to be treated as less than others. For they were not just lepers, they were still human beings, mothers and sons and daughters, children of the Most High God. It was this systematic exclusion, this crushing of the spirits of God's children by those who represented God, this violation of the fundamental freedom that permeates the Gospels, this incited the anger of Jesus and moved him to counsel the particular victim, and by extension, all who are victimized by unjust power, to publicly repudiate the agents of injustice and the systems they administer. So when the man fell begging at Jesus' feet, the anger that welled up in Jesus was not anger at the man, but at the authorities' refusal to apply strategy 1, which, remember, is to treat the people's needs as holy. Jesus' response in Mark 1 shows us that there are things we should be angry about. There are things that we must say and do as a testimony against every action, every system, every policy, and every institution that excludes any of God's children from the fullest fruits of life for any reason. That is to say, we must endeavor to love everyone, but we must also take sides. Because we cannot be against injustice if we do not take the side of justice. We must be angered by the mistreatment of any of God's children. When we see people hurt and excluded in the name of God, we should be angry. When we see church leaders misleading and exploiting the faithful, just like the religious leaders Jesus died opposing, we should get angry. When we see a tiny group of elites taking most of the nation's economic harvest for themselves, we should get angry. When we see corporate executives being paid in 1 year's salary what the average worker can never earn in a lifetime, it should make us angry. When we see some Americans excluded like lepers from the best this nation has to offer because of their religion or their gender or their ethnicity or their class or who they love, we should get angry. But our anger, our outrage, our righteous indignation must remain focused on the perversion of policies and traditions meant for good into laws and practices that do harm and evil. Not on particular groups or personalities, but on unjust policies and practices. Okay, I'm almost done, and hopefully you can see that I'm really passionate about this, especially as we are just a few weeks away from this election. If you notice, at the end of the story, Jesus told the healed man to say nothing to anyone. You may be wondering why the secrecy. Being healed is a good thing. You want to testify about it. Dr. Hendricks suggests that, as a biblical scholar, his belief is Jesus told the man, don't say anything to anyone, because Jesus didn't want anyone to have the opportunity to talk the man out of taking the public stand that Jesus had instructed him to take. I mean, think about it. The leper was told to go speak truth to power in the temple. Imagine as he was walking to the temple and shared what he was about to do, that somebody may have told him, you don't want to do that. Just go home and be happy you're clean again. Let things be. But more important, perhaps, is the implication that Jesus didn't want the man to get caught up in talk without action. Jesus's instructions were to go, show, and offer. In other words, Jesus told him, don't just talk about it, be about it. It is important that we talk about peace and justice and fairness and equity, but we must also act against the systems that stand in their way. We must move beyond conference after conference, meeting after meeting, beyond pronouncements and empty talk, so we may again enter into systemic struggle to achieve the justice of God for all. It is only through passionate action that we will manifest our authority to dismantle every oppressive and exclusionary principality and power that stands in the way of true community. So what did Jesus do in this instance that was strategic? He took his focus off himself and placed it on the plight of the people. Despite the many times he was attacked, you can check the record. He was called the devil. His life was threatened. His intentions questioned. Jesus never expressed anger except at the mistreatment of others. Jesus saved his energy and his passion to fuel his service. And we must do the same. Dr. Hendricks concludes his explanation of this strategy by saying that the example of Jesus tells us that we must be passionately proactive in our struggle against practices, structures, systems, and attitudes of unjust entitlement that stand in the way of a fully inclusive and loving society. Jesus' example shows us that, like his anger, our own anger should propel us to go to the seat of unjust power And that seat may be in the church. It could be on the school board or city council, the board of supervisors, at the state capitol, or even the White House. And we must give our collective testimony against the priests of oppression that we, the people, are neither unclean or unworthy, and therefore we will not accept second-class status or second-class treatment. Jesus models for us that we must be outraged by social practices and policies that favor any of God's children over others. We must be outraged by systematic exclusions, all types of elitism, and every hierarchical structure that allows only the chosen few to fully enjoy the riches of community. And we must use that anger to move us to righteous action. So as we get ready to end this week, I want to make sure this strategy is applicable for us living in 21st century America. Think about what people or communities are being treated as second-class citizens. What mistreatment have we seen that we should raise our voices and take action on their behalf? For a little history, I thought back to a few things that we've seen. I'm thinking about the early 1980s when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was made worse by conservative Christians claiming it to be God's judgment on homosexuality, which led to people not understanding that everyone having sex, heterosexuals included, needed to be cautious, that intravenous drug users should not share needles, and mothers breastfeeding their babies had to be careful. And when we found out someone had the virus, they were treated differently. Many of you will remember that. Many were forced to live like lepers, secluded from loved ones and the rest of society. In the 1980s and 90s, when crack was king, those who were addicted to the drug were ostracized and criminalized rather than provided with treatment options. And it's not coincidental that those who preferred cocaine were more often white, and their punishment for possession was more lenient than their black counterparts. And most recently, we have seen this with the response to the global pandemic that hit us in 2020. In the beginning, when we didn't really know too much about what was going on, people who had caught the coronavirus for no fault of their own were isolated and quarantined like lepers in the Bible. You'll remember that one of the candidates running for president actually called it a virus that came from a certain country, and then we saw an uptick in violence toward people of that descent. I've seen the stories of how family members could not be with their loved ones during the last days of their lives because of their COVID status. And I get that we had to be careful. Like Leviticus 13 told us, we had to do our part to keep the whole community safe. But in doing so, some people were mistreated. And that should make all of God's children angry. That concludes today's Bible study, and I hope you share this video and then come back next week when we'll talk about the sixth political strategy that impacted Jesus' life and ministry. Your regular teacher, Pastor Tyrone Nelson, will be back. As we get ready for our after Bible study chat, I want to hear your response to these two questions. What people or communities are being treated as second-class citizens? And what mistreatment have we seen that we should raise our voices and take action on the behalf of our neighbors? With that, it's time to head over to our After Bible Study chat. You can get there three ways. You can download the Dialpad Meetings app or go to meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC or call 804-203-9011. Thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson, and we look forward to you joining us again.